This story is about the day my father accused me of faking a medical emergency for attention while I was literally having a stroke. What he didn't know was that our home security system was recording everything. By the time this was over, his words would cost him his job, his reputation, and his relationship with half the family. But let me start from the beginning, because understanding how we got to that moment requires knowing the kind of person my father really was behind closed doors.
I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Marcus Chen, and I'm 28 years old. I work as a software engineer at a tech startup in Austin, Texas. Good job, decent salary, pretty normal life overall. But my family situation has never been what you'd call normal. My father, Robert Chen, is 55 and works as a regional manager for a large insurance company. He's the type of guy who spent his entire career climbing the corporate ladder, and somewhere along the way, he developed this obsession with appearances and what he calls proper behavior. My mother, Linda, is 52 and works part-time as a bookkeeper for a local accounting firm. She's always been the peacekeeper in our family, which, unfortunately, means she usually sides with whatever keeps my father calm. Then there's my younger sister, Emma, who's 24 and just graduated from nursing school. Emma and I have always been close, probably because we both learned early on that Dad's approval was conditional and his disappointment could be devastating. Growing up in the Chen household meant walking on eggshells around my father's moods and expectations. He had this way of making everything about respect and family hierarchy. If you questioned him, you were being disrespectful. If you showed emotion, you were being dramatic. If you had a problem, you were probably exaggerating or looking for sympathy. This wasn't just strict parenting. This was psychological conditioning that made you second-guess your own experiences. The pattern started when I was pretty young. I remember being maybe 8 years old, crying because I'd fallen off my bike and scraped up my knees pretty badly. Instead of comfort, I got a lecture about how boys don't cry over minor injuries and how I needed to toughen up. When I was 12 and came down with what turned out to be pneumonia, he spent 2 days telling me I was fine and just trying to get out of school before Mom finally insisted on taking me to the doctor. This attitude got worse as I got older. During high school, I developed pretty severe anxiety around test time. Instead of understanding or support, I got accusations of making excuses for poor performance. When I had my wisdom teeth removed junior year and was in genuine pain for days afterward, he kept saying I was milking it for attention and that people used to handle dental procedures without all the dramatics. College was supposed to be my escape, but even from a distance, his influence was suffocating. He'd call to check on my grades, question my course choices, and always had something to say about how I was spending my time or money. When I chose computer science over business like he wanted, he spent months making comments about how I was being impractical and would regret not following his guidance. The worst part was how he'd trained the rest of the family to see things his way. Mom would always start conversations about my problems with phrases like, "You know how your father feels about complaining," or "Let's not upset your father with this." Emma learned early to keep her struggles to herself rather than deal with his dismissive reactions. After college, I moved back to Austin for work, and like an idiot, I decided to rent the small apartment above my parents' garage. It seemed practical at the time, close to my job, affordable rent, and I thought maybe our relationship would improve now that I was an independent adult with a career. Wrong on all counts. If anything, living so close made his controlling tendencies worse. He had opinions about my work schedule, my social life, when I came and went, how I maintained the apartment. The man somehow made living in a separate unit feel like living under his microscope. Every conversation became an opportunity for him to point out something I could be doing better or differently. The garage apartment itself was actually pretty nice. 1 bedroom, small kitchen, living area, and bathroom. Previous owners had converted it for their adult son, so it had its own entrance and everything. What it also had, and what would become crucial later, was a comprehensive security system. The whole property was wired with cameras: front door, backyard, driveway, and yes, interior cameras in the main house's common areas. Dad was paranoid about break-ins and had installed the whole system 2 years earlier. I was paying $800 a month in rent, which was fair for the area, but Dad treated it like I was living there out of his generosity. He'd make comments about how he was doing me a favor, how I should be more grateful, and how living there was a privilege I could lose if I didn't maintain his standards of behavior. This brings me to the health issues that had been developing over the past year. I'd been having what I thought were stress headaches, some dizziness, occasional blurred vision. Nothing dramatic, but enough that I'd mentioned it to my doctor during my annual physical. He'd run some basic tests, everything came back normal, and he suggested it might be work stress or eye strain from too much screen time. When I mentioned these symptoms to my family, the reactions were predictable. Dad immediately started talking about how young people today dramatize every little ache and pain, how his generation just dealt with discomfort without running to doctors constantly. Mom would nod along and suggest maybe I needed to manage my stress better. Even Emma, who should have known better given her medical training, seemed to think I was probably just overdoing it at work. So I stopped talking about the symptoms, even though they were getting worse. The headaches were becoming more frequent and more severe. Sometimes the dizziness would hit me so hard I'd have to sit down wherever I was. My vision would get weird, not just blurry, but sometimes I'd see these strange flashing lights or dark spots. Looking back now, these were all warning signs of what was coming. But when you've spent your whole life being told you're dramatic, that you exaggerate problems, that you're probably just seeking attention, you learn to minimize your own experiences. You start to believe that what you're feeling isn't as serious as it seems. In the morning, everything changed like any other Saturday. It was early October, beautiful fall weather in Austin. I'd planned to spend the day working on a personal coding project and maybe grab lunch with some friends later. I woke up around 8 a.m., feeling pretty normal, made coffee, and sat down at my computer. Around 10:30, I started getting one of those headaches. Not unusual, so I took some ibuprofen and tried to push through it. But this one felt different, more intense, and it came with this weird sensation like pressure building inside my skull. The vision problems started maybe 20 minutes later. Not just the usual blurriness, but actual blind spots and these zigzag light patterns that made it hard to focus on my screen. I was starting to feel genuinely worried, which for someone trained to minimize their symptoms meant something was really wrong. I decided to go downstairs and maybe ask Mom if she thought I should call my doctor or head to urgent care. It was Saturday, so both my parents were home. I made it down the exterior stairs from my apartment, but by the time I reached the main house's back door, the symptoms were getting much worse. The headache had become this crushing pain unlike anything I'd ever experienced. My vision was deteriorating rapidly, and I was starting to feel confused and disoriented. I knocked on the back door and called out for Mom. She answered, took one look at me, and immediately looked concerned. I must have appeared as bad as I felt because her first reaction was to ask what was wrong and guide me to a chair in the kitchen. That's when Dad walked in, saw me sitting there holding my head, and his face immediately shifted to that familiar expression of irritation and disappointment. Before I could even explain what was happening, he launched into his usual routine about how I always seemed to have some health crisis whenever it was convenient, how I never could just handle things like an adult. Mom was trying to take my symptoms seriously, asking questions about the pain and suggesting we call someone, but Dad kept interrupting with comments about how I was probably just hungover or hadn't been taking care of herself properly. The more concerned Mom became, the more dismissive and hostile he got.
And that's when it happened. While my father was mid-sentence, telling my mother that I was clearly just being dramatic again, everything went sideways, literally. The left side of my body stopped working, my arm dropped, my leg gave out, and suddenly I couldn't form words properly. I tried to tell them something was seriously wrong, but what came out was garbled nonsense. My father looked at this scene, his son clearly having some kind of medical emergency, and his response was to roll his eyes and say the words that would haunt him for months afterward. "Oh, come on, Marcus. Stop being so damn attention-seeking. This dramatic bullshit is getting old." What he didn't realize was that every word was being recorded by the security camera mounted in the corner of the kitchen. The stroke happened on a Saturday, but to understand how we got to that moment, you need to know about the years of systematic dismissal that led up to it. This wasn't just one bad reaction to a medical emergency. This was the culmination of decades of my father treating my health concerns like personal inconveniences. When I was 15, I started having severe stomach pains that would double me over during school. We're talking about pains so intense that I'd break out in cold sweats and couldn't stand up straight. The school nurse called home multiple times, and each time, Dad would arrive looking annoyed and embarrassed. He'd march me out to the car, muttering about how I was disrupting his workday for what was probably just gas or teenage dramatics. This went on for 3 months. 3 months of me writhing in pain, begging to see a doctor, while he insisted I was either faking it or being overly sensitive to normal digestive discomfort. Mom would try to advocate for me, but Dad had this way of making her feel like she was enabling my weakness if she took my side. He'd say things like, "Linda, if you keep babying him, he'll never learn to handle real problems." Finally, one night, the pain was so severe that I passed out in the bathroom. Mom found me unconscious on the floor and rushed me to the emergency room despite Dad's protests. Turned out I had a severe case of appendicitis that was dangerously close to rupturing. The surgeon told my parents that waiting another day or two could have been fatal. Dad's response to nearly losing his son due to his stubborn refusal to take my symptoms seriously, he focused on the hospital bill and how I should have described the pain better if it was really that serious. No apology, no acknowledgement that he'd been wrong, just irritation about the inconvenience and expense. This became the template for how medical issues were handled in our family. When Emma broke her wrist during soccer practice junior year, Dad spent the entire drive to urgent care lecturing her about being more careful and not expecting everyone to drop everything just because she couldn't handle a little pain. The x-rays showed 2 fractures, and she needed surgery. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The pattern extended beyond just medical issues. Dad had this fundamental belief that anything negative that happened to his children was either our fault, exaggerated, or a character flaw that needed to be corrected rather than addressed. Failed a test? Clearly not studying hard enough, not a learning difficulty. Having trouble with friends? Obviously not trying hard enough to fit in, not possible that kids were being cruel. Struggling with anything meant you were weak, dramatic, or looking for special treatment. Living in the garage apartment had given me a front row seat to how he treated other people's health concerns too. Our neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly widow who lived alone, would sometimes call Dad when she needed help with heavy lifting or yard work. He'd always help, but afterward he'd come home complaining about how old people exaggerate their limitations and how she could probably do more for herself if she just tried harder. When Mom started having back problems from her bookkeeping job, sitting hunched over paperwork for hours every day, Dad's solution was to tell her she needed to toughen up and stop making excuses. He refused to consider that maybe she needed a better chair or ergonomic setup. When she finally went to physical therapy on her own, he complained about the cost and time commitment, saying she was being dramatic about normal workplace aches. The most telling incident happened about 6 months before my stroke. Emma, fresh out of nursing school and working her first job at Austin General, came home exhausted after a particularly brutal shift. She'd been on her feet for 14 hours straight, dealing with multiple emergencies, and she was emotionally drained from losing a patient despite her best efforts. She sat at the kitchen table, still in her scrubs, and started telling us about her day. She wasn't complaining or asking for sympathy, just sharing her experience with her family. Dad listened for maybe 2 minutes before launching into a speech about how healthcare workers these days don't have the resilience of previous generations, how she needed to develop thicker skin if she wanted to survive in the medical field. Emma, who had just spent the day literally saving lives, was told she was being too sensitive about the realities of her job. This from a man who complained if his coffee wasn't the right temperature or if traffic made him 5 minutes late to work. The hypocrisy was staggering, but by that point, none of us were surprised. What made all this worse was Dad's professional reputation. At work, Robert Chen was known as a competent, reliable manager who got results. His colleagues respected him, his superiors valued his dedication, and he'd built a solid career over 25 years with the same company. To the outside world, he was a successful family man who'd raised two educated, employed children. This public persona made questioning his behavior feel almost impossible. When relatives or family friends were around, Dad would put on this caring, concerned father act. He'd ask about our jobs, our health, our plans for the future, all the things a good parent should do. But the moment we were alone, the mask would slip, and we'd be back to being disappointments who needed constant correction. The financial dynamic made everything more complicated. Even though I was paying rent for the apartment, Dad treated it like charity. He'd remind me regularly that he could easily rent it out to strangers for more money, that he was giving me a family discount out of the goodness of his heart. This wasn't true. I'd checked comparable rentals in the area, and I was paying market rate, but it created this atmosphere where I was supposed to be grateful for the privilege of paying him $800 a month. More insidiously, he used my living situation to justify his continued involvement in my personal life. Since I was living on his property, he felt entitled to opinions about my schedule, my visitors, my lifestyle choices. If I came home late from work or social events, I'd get comments the next day about responsibility and setting a good example. If I had friends over, he'd find reasons to interrupt or make his presence known, usually with subtle criticisms about noise levels or parking arrangements. The garage apartment had its own entrance, but Dad had keys to everything, and he'd use them. I'd come home to find he'd been inside, ostensibly to check on maintenance issues, but really to satisfy his need to monitor and control his adult son's living space. He'd move things around, leave notes about cleanliness or organization, or just make comments later about what he'd observed. Privacy was a foreign concept in the Chen household. Dad had installed the security camera system, supposedly for protection, but it quickly became clear that it was really about surveillance. There were cameras covering every approach to the property, motion sensors on all the doors, and yes, those interior cameras in the main house's common areas that he claimed were for monitoring service workers and deliveries. The system was connected to an app on his phone, and he'd regularly review footage. Not because anything had happened, but because he wanted to know who was coming and going, when, and for how long. He'd make casual comments about my visitors, my schedule, my habits, all information gleaned from his obsessive monitoring of the camera feeds. This surveillance extended to medical situations too. The few times I'd had to call in sick to work, Dad would somehow know exactly how long I'd been in bed, when I'd gotten up, what I'd eaten. He'd use this information to support his theories about whether I was really sick or just being lazy. If I was well enough to make toast, clearly I was well enough to go to work. The psychological impact of living under this constant scrutiny was exhausting. You start to second-guess every decision, every reaction, every expression of discomfort or need. When someone spends years telling you that your problems aren't real, that your pain is exaggerated, that your concerns are attention-seeking behavior, you begin to internalize those messages. By the time I was 28, I'd become an expert at minimizing my own experiences. Headache? Probably nothing. Dizziness? Just tired. Vision problems? Too much screen time. I'd trained myself to dismiss symptoms that should have sent me straight to a doctor because I'd learned that seeking help would result in lectures about weakness and dramatics. The irony was that Dad's behavior had created exactly the situation he claimed to be preventing. By consistently dismissing legitimate health concerns, he had made me less likely to seek appropriate medical care, more likely to downplay serious symptoms, and more prone to the kind of dangerous delays that could turn manageable conditions into medical emergencies. This foundation of dismissal, surveillance, and psychological manipulation had been building for decades by the time I woke up that Saturday morning in October. Every ignored symptom, every dismissed concern, every lecture about toughness and responsibility had led to this moment where I was hesitating to seek help even when my body was clearly in serious distress. What Dad didn't realize was that his years of documented behavior, captured by his own security system, were about to become the evidence that would destroy everything he'd built. His obsession with monitoring and controlling his family was about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible. The months leading up to my stroke were marked by an escalating pattern of conflicts that should have been warning signs for everyone involved. What started as Dad's usual dismissive attitude toward my health concerns evolved into something much more aggressive and personal. Looking back, I can see how each incident built upon the last, creating a powder keg of resentment and frustration that was bound to explode. The first major confrontation happened in July, about 3 months before the stroke. I'd been experiencing those headaches and vision problems more frequently, and they were starting to impact my work performance. During a particularly important client presentation, I had one of those episodes where my vision got blurry and I started seeing those zigzag patterns. I managed to get through it, but my boss, Sarah Martinez, noticed I seemed off and asked if everything was okay. I explained that I'd been having some health issues and was planning to see a doctor about them. Sarah was understanding and even suggested I take a few hours off to get checked out that same day. So I did. I went to an urgent care clinic and saw Dr. Patricia Williams, who took my symptoms seriously and ordered some preliminary tests. She also referred me to a neurologist for more comprehensive evaluation. When I got home that evening, I was actually feeling optimistic. Finally, someone was taking my concerns seriously, and we were going to get to the bottom of what was happening. I made the mistake of sharing this with my family over dinner, thinking maybe Dad would be relieved that I was being proactive about my health. Instead, he launched into a tirade about how I was wasting money on unnecessary medical procedures, how doctors these days just order tests to make money off anxious patients, and how I was probably just stressed from work. When I mentioned that my boss had been supportive and encouraged me to get checked out, he got even more upset. "Great, now your employer thinks you're unreliable," he said, stabbing at his meatloaf aggressively. "You're giving them the impression that you can't handle basic job responsibilities without running to doctors for every little headache. This is exactly the kind of behavior that kills careers." Mom tried to mediate, suggesting that getting checked out was responsible, but Dad shut her down immediately. "Linda, stop enabling this hypochondriac behavior. Marcus needs to learn the difference between normal discomfort and actual medical emergencies. At his age, I was working 12-hour days in construction and never complained about headaches." The conversation escalated when I pointed out that his construction job was 30 years ago and that headaches severe enough to affect my vision probably warranted medical attention. This apparently crossed a line because Dad slammed his fist on the table and accused me of being disrespectful and argumentative. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he yelled. "You can't handle any criticism without getting defensive. You're 28 years old, Marcus. Start acting like an adult instead of a child who needs medical attention every time life gets a little challenging." Emma, who had been quiet through most of this, finally spoke up. As someone who just finished nursing school, she pointed out that unexplained headaches with visual disturbances were legitimate concerns that should be evaluated by a professional. This was the wrong thing to say. Dad turned on Emma with a venomous look I'd rarely seen before. "Don't you start with the medical expert routine. Just because you have a nursing degree doesn't mean you need to encourage your brother's attention-seeking behavior. You're supposed to support your family, not enable weakness." The fight ended with me storming out and Emma in tears. Mom spent the rest of the evening trying to smooth things over, but the damage was done. Dad had made it clear that seeking medical care for my symptoms was a betrayal of family values and a sign of personal weakness. The neurologist appointment, when it finally happened in early August, revealed some concerning findings. Dr. James Thompson found irregularities in my blood pressure readings and ordered additional tests, including an MRI and some specialized blood work. He explained that my symptoms could indicate several different conditions, some more serious than others, and that we needed to rule out various possibilities. When I shared this information with my family, Dad's reaction was even worse than before. He accused me of doctor shopping until I found someone who would validate my imaginary problems. He claimed that neurologists were notorious for ordering expensive tests for minor issues because it was profitable. When I mentioned that my insurance was covering most of the costs, he switched tactics and started talking about how I was wasting taxpayer money through inflated insurance premiums. "This is what's wrong with your generation," he said during what became a 2-hour lecture. No resilience, no ability to tough things out. Everything needs to be a medical crisis that requires expensive specialists and fancy tests. Your grandfather worked in steel mills for 40 years and never saw a neurologist in his life. The MRI appointment was scheduled for late August, and I made the mistake of asking Dad if I could borrow his car since mine was in the shop for repairs. This simple request triggered another explosion about how I was inconveniencing the entire family with my medical drama. He refused to let me use the car and suggested I take public transportation to my unnecessary appointment. Emma ended up driving me, which created another family crisis. Dad accused her of taking sides and enabling my behavior. He threatened to stop helping with her student loan payments if she continued to support what he called my medical attention seeking. This put Emma in an impossible position. She knew my symptoms were legitimate, but she couldn't afford to lose Dad's financial support. The MRI results showed some anomalies that Dr. Thompson wanted to monitor closely. He scheduled follow-up appointments and recommended that I keep a detailed symptom diary. He also mentioned that given my family history, Dad's father had died of a stroke at 62, we needed to be particularly vigilant about cardiovascular risk factors. When I shared this information, including the family history connection, Dad went ballistic. He accused me of dragging his deceased father into my medical drama and claimed I was trying to manipulate the situation by invoking family tragedy. According to him, his father's stroke was completely unrelated to anything I was experiencing, and suggesting otherwise was disrespectful to his memory. This fight was different from the others. Dad didn't just dismiss my symptoms. He became personally insulting in a way that crossed lines we'd never crossed before. He called me a hypochondriac, attention-seeking, manipulative, and weak. He said I was an embarrassment to the family and that he was ashamed to have raised someone so unable to handle normal life challenges. Mom sat in stunned silence during this tirade. Emma tried to leave the room, but Dad ordered her to stay and listen to what happened when family members enable each other's weaknesses. The whole scene was captured by the kitchen security camera, though none of us were thinking about that at the time. September brought a new dimension to the conflict when my work situation became more complicated. The ongoing symptoms were affecting my concentration and productivity, and I'd had to leave early or work from home several times when the headaches became severe. Sarah was still supportive, but I could tell she was getting concerned about my reliability. Dad somehow found out about my work challenges, probably through his monitoring of my comings and goings, and used this as ammunition for his argument that my medical fixation was destroying my career. He started making comments about how employers lose trust in workers who constantly have health issues, how I was probably going to get fired if I kept this up, and how no one would want to hire someone with a reputation for being unreliable. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. I was dealing with increasingly severe symptoms, a complex medical workup that hadn't yet provided clear answers, work stress, and constant family conflict. Every symptom was scrutinized and dismissed. Every doctor's appointment was treated as evidence of my weakness. Every impact on my daily life was characterized as drama and attention-seeking. The worst part was how Dad had recruited other family members into his campaign against my medical concerns. He'd call his brother, my Uncle Tom, and complain about how I was wasting money on doctors and being dramatic about minor health issues. Uncle Tom, who trusted Dad's judgment, started making similar comments during family gatherings. Even my grandmother, Dad's mother, began expressing concern about how much medical attention I was seeking for what seemed like normal stress symptoms. By early October, I'd essentially stopped talking about my symptoms at home. The cost of sharing information about my health had become too high. When headaches struck, I'd hide in my apartment until they passed. When vision problems occurred at family dinners, I'd make excuses and leave early. I was essentially managing a potentially serious medical condition in isolation because my own family had made it clear that acknowledging my symptoms was unacceptable. This isolation made everything worse. Without family support, I started second-guessing my doctors, wondering if maybe Dad was right and I was overreacting to normal stress symptoms. I began canceling follow-up appointments and stopped keeping the symptom diary Dr. Thompson had recommended.
The medical care that might have prevented my stroke was being sabotaged by family pressure to minimize and ignore my symptoms. The final escalation came just a week before my stroke. I'd had a particularly bad episode at work, severe headache, vision problems, and some confusion that lasted for almost an hour. Sarah sent me home and strongly suggested I contact my doctor immediately. I called Dr. Thompson's office and was told to come in that afternoon for evaluation. When I got home to change clothes before the appointment, Dad was waiting for me. He'd apparently seen me come home early through the security cameras and wanted to know why I wasn't at work. When I explained about the episode and the doctor's appointment, he exploded in a way that was frightening even by his standards. He accused me of faking symptoms to get out of work, of using medical excuses to avoid responsibility, and of being a drain on everyone around me. He threatened to raise my rent if I didn't stop this medical circus, and warned that he was losing patience with my behavior. Most ominously, he said that if I kept this up, I might find that living in his garage apartment wasn't as secure as I thought. That threat hung over everything that followed. I was essentially being told to choose between my health and my housing. The message was clear: stop seeking medical care or face serious consequences. This level of coercion and manipulation created an environment where even reporting serious symptoms felt dangerous. The stage was set for disaster. I was having increasingly severe symptoms that I'd been conditioned to minimize and hide. My support system had been turned against me, my access to medical care was being threatened. And all of this was building toward a Saturday morning in October when everything would finally come to a head in the most dramatic and documented way possible. The morning of October 15th started deceptively normal. I'd managed to sleep through the night without major symptoms for the first time in weeks, and I actually woke up feeling optimistic. The Texas weather was perfect: crisp fall air, clear skies, the kind of day that makes you forget about your problems for a while. I had plans to work on a personal coding project I'd been neglecting, and maybe catch up with my college friend Danny later that afternoon. I made my usual coffee around 8 a.m. and settled at my desk to start working. The project was something I'd been excited about, a mobile app that would help mechanics track maintenance schedules more efficiently. It was the kind of work that usually absorbed me completely, but about 2 hours in, I started noticing the familiar warning signs. The headache began as a dull pressure behind my right eye, nothing unusual by that point. I took some ibuprofen and tried to push through it, figuring it would pass like the others had. But within 20 minutes, the pain had intensified to a level I'd never experienced before. This wasn't like my previous headaches. It felt like someone was driving a railroad spike through my skull with methodical precision. Then came the vision problems, but these were different too. Instead of the usual blurriness or zigzag patterns, I was seeing actual blind spots, dark patches in my visual field that made it impossible to focus on my computer screen. When I tried to save my work, I realized I was having trouble coordinating my mouse movements. My hand felt clumsy and unresponsive. The smart thing would have been to call 911 immediately, but months of being conditioned to minimize my symptoms, to avoid being seen as dramatic or attention-seeking, made me hesitate. Maybe this was just a really bad version of my usual episodes. Maybe if I lay down for a while, it would pass. Maybe I was overreacting, and this was exactly the kind of behavior Dad had been warning me about. I managed to stumble to my bed and lay down, hoping rest would help. Instead, everything got worse. The headache became so severe that I couldn't think clearly. My vision continued deteriorating, and I started feeling nauseous in a way that was completely different from any previous experience. This was my body screaming that something was catastrophically wrong, but I'd been so thoroughly trained to doubt my own perceptions that I still hesitated to act. After maybe 30 minutes of lying there in agony, I finally admitted that this was beyond anything I could handle alone. I needed help, and I needed it immediately. The problem was that my phone was back at my desk, and when I tried to get up, I discovered that my coordination was seriously compromised. Walking the 15 feet to my desk felt like trying to navigate through quicksand while the room spun around me. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but when I attempted to speak, the words came out slurred and incomprehensible. This was the moment when real panic set in. Whatever was happening to me was affecting my ability to communicate clearly enough to get emergency help. I could think of the words I wanted to say, but my mouth wasn't cooperating. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. Instead of calling 911 and struggling to communicate with operators, I decided to go downstairs to my parents. They were right there, just 50 feet away in the main house. Mom would understand that something was seriously wrong, and she could call for help while staying with me. Even if Dad was dismissive initially, surely when he saw how impaired I was, he'd realize this wasn't one of my usual complaints. The journey down the exterior stairs from my apartment was terrifying. I had to grip the railing with both hands and take each step slowly because my balance was completely off. By the time I reached the bottom, I was sweating profusely despite the cool morning air, and my heart was racing in a way that made everything feel even more surreal. I knocked on the back door of the main house, but instead of my usual confident knock, it came out as a weak, uncoordinated tapping. I tried to call out for Mom, but my voice sounded strange even to me, thick and slurred like I'd been drinking heavily. When Mom opened the door and saw me standing there, swaying slightly and clearly in distress, her face immediately shifted to concern. "Marcus, honey, what's wrong?" she asked, reaching out to steady me as I nearly lost my balance stepping through the doorway. I tried to explain what was happening, but the words came out jumbled. Head, really bad, can't see right, something is wrong. It was frustrating beyond description to have clear thoughts but be unable to express them coherently. Mom guided me to one of the kitchen chairs, and I could see the worry in her eyes as she took in my condition. "Should I call 911?" she asked. "You look really pale, and you're not talking normally." Before I could attempt to answer, Dad walked into the kitchen. He had apparently heard the commotion and came to investigate. The moment he saw me sitting there, his expression didn't shift to concern like Mom's had. It shifted to that familiar look of irritation and skepticism that I'd seen so many times before. "What's going on now?" he asked, but his tone suggested he already assumed this was another episode of what he considered my ongoing medical dramatics. Mom started to explain that I seemed to be having some kind of serious episode, that my speech was slurred, and I appeared to be in significant distress. But Dad cut her off before she could finish. "Let me guess," he said, crossing his arms and looking at me with undisguised annoyance. "Another one of these mysterious health crises that conveniently happen on weekends when you don't have to work?" I tried to tell him this was different, that something was really wrong, but what came out was an incoherent mumble that only seemed to reinforce his assumption that I was being dramatic. The harder I tried to speak clearly, the more garbled my words became, and I could see Dad's skepticism hardening into contempt.
Marcus, this is getting ridiculous, he continued, his voice rising. Every few weeks, it's something new. Headaches, vision problems. Now you're acting like you can't even speak properly. Do you have any idea how this looks? How does it reflect on this family when you constantly need medical attention for problems that somehow never show up on any tests? Mom tried to intervene. "Robert, look at him. Something is clearly wrong. His face looks different and he's having trouble talking. We should call someone." But Dad was just getting started. This wasn't just dismissal. This was an attack that had been building for months. "Linda, stop enabling this behavior. Can't you see what's happening here? Marcus has learned that if he acts sick enough, if he makes his symptoms dramatic enough, everyone will drop everything and focus on him. This is classic attention-seeking behavior." The room started spinning more violently, and I felt a strange sensation spreading down the left side of my body. My left arm, which had been resting on the kitchen table, suddenly felt heavy and unresponsive. When I tried to lift it, it barely moved. This new symptom should have been a clear indication that something neurological was happening, but Dad interpreted my struggle to move my arm as part of the performance. "Oh, now your arm doesn't work either?" he said with a bitter laugh. "How convenient. What's next, Marcus? Are you going to collapse on the floor? Maybe have some kind of seizure? You've really outdone yourself this time." I was becoming genuinely frightened as more of my body stopped responding normally.
My left leg felt weak and tingly, and the left side of my face was starting to feel numb. I tried to stand up to show them that I was losing function on one entire side of my body, but when I attempted to put weight on my left leg, it buckled and I fell back into the chair. This should have been the moment when anyone with basic medical knowledge, or even basic human compassion, would have realized they were witnessing a medical emergency. Instead, Dad saw it as confirmation of his theory about my manipulative behavior. "Unbelievable," he said, shaking his head in disgust. "You're actually going to sit there and pretend you can't use your arm and leg now? This is a new low, Marcus, even for you. What do you think this is going to accomplish? Do you think we're going to rush you to the hospital so doctors can run more expensive tests that will show absolutely nothing wrong with you?" Mom was getting more agitated, clearly torn between her husband's certainty and her own observations of my deteriorating condition. "Robert, I really think we should call someone. He looks terrible, and the way he's talking." "The way he's talking is an act," Dad snapped. "People don't just suddenly lose the ability to speak clearly unless they're having a stroke. And Marcus is 28 years old. 28-year-olds don't have strokes. They have anxiety attacks and dramatic episodes when they want attention." The irony of his words would become apparent very soon. But in that moment, his absolute certainty that young people don't have strokes reinforced his dismissal of my symptoms. In his mind, he'd ruled out the one condition that could explain everything I was experiencing, which meant everything I was experiencing had to be fake. That's when the worst of it hit. While Dad was mid-sentence, explaining to Mom why my symptoms couldn't possibly be real, the left side of my body essentially shut down completely. My left arm went completely limp, sliding off the table. My left leg lost all strength, and I slumped sideways in the chair. Most terrifying of all, when I tried to tell them what was happening, no coherent words came out at all, just garbled sounds that bore no resemblance to language. I was having a stroke, right there in my parents' kitchen at 28 years old, exactly what Dad had just declared impossible for someone my age. And his reaction to seeing his son lose basic motor and speech functions wasn't concern or panic. It was rage at what he perceived as an escalation of my attention-seeking performance. "Oh, come on, Marcus," he shouted, his face red with anger and frustration. "Stop being so damn attention-seeking. This dramatic bullshit is getting old. You think we can't see right through this act?" Those words, calling me attention-seeking while I was literally having a stroke in front of him, were captured in perfect digital clarity by the security camera mounted in the corner of the kitchen. The same surveillance system Dad had installed to monitor and control his family was now recording what would become the most damning evidence against him. But in that moment, as consciousness started slipping away and my body continued shutting down, I wasn't thinking about cameras or evidence or consequences. I was just a 28-year-old man having a life-threatening medical emergency while his father accused him of faking it for attention. The betrayal was almost as devastating as the stroke itself. The last thing I remember clearly was the sound of Mom screaming for Dad to call 911, her voice finally cutting through his rage as she realized that whatever was happening to me was very, very real. The next thing I remember was waking up in the ICU at Austin General Hospital 3 days later. The recovery process was slow and frustrating. My speech was still slurred, my left side was weak, and I had gaps in my memory about what had happened. But as the fog cleared and nurses explained what I'd been through, one fact became crystal clear. I'd suffered a major ischemic stroke caused by an undiagnosed arterial condition that should have been caught earlier if my symptoms had been taken seriously. Emma was the first family member I saw when I fully regained consciousness. She was sitting beside my bed in her scrubs, having just finished a shift in the same hospital where I was being treated. Her eyes were red from crying, and when she saw me awake and trying to speak, she broke down completely. "Marcus, I'm so sorry," she whispered, gripping my hand. "I should have thought harder. I should have called 911 myself when I saw you that morning. I knew something was seriously wrong, but Dad was so convinced you were faking it, and I should have trusted my medical training." Through halting speech, I managed to ask what had happened after I collapsed.
Emma's account was both infuriating and enlightening. After Mom finally screamed at Dad to call 911, he'd reluctantly made the call, but continued insisting to the paramedics that I was probably having an anxiety attack or some kind of psychological episode. Even as EMTs were performing stroke assessments and finding clear neurological deficits, Dad was telling them about my history of attention-seeking behavior and pattern of imaginary medical crises. The paramedics, thank God, ignored him completely. They recognized stroke symptoms immediately and rushed me to the hospital with lights and sirens. The emergency room team confirmed what was obvious to everyone except my father. I was having a serious stroke that required immediate intervention. They administered clot-busting drugs and performed emergency procedures that likely saved my life and prevented more severe permanent damage. But here's where it gets interesting. During my second day in the ICU, while I was still unconscious, my boss, Sarah Martinez, had called the house looking for me. I'd missed 2 days of work without calling in, which was completely unlike me. When Dad answered the phone, he'd apparently told her that I was in another one of his medical episodes and that she shouldn't worry because he probably just needs attention. Sarah, who'd been increasingly concerned about my health issues and had specifically told me to see doctors about my symptoms, was shocked by Dad's dismissive attitude about his son being hospitalized. She'd immediately called the hospital to check on me and discovered from the ICU nurses that I'd suffered a severe stroke and was in critical condition. This was the first crack in Dad's carefully constructed narrative. Sarah knew my work performance, knew I wasn't the type to fake illnesses or seek attention, and knew that the symptoms I'd been experiencing were exactly the kind that could lead to stroke. When she learned that Dad had been dismissing and minimizing a legitimate medical emergency, she started asking questions that Dad wasn't prepared to answer. Emma told me all this while I was still processing the magnitude of what had happened, but she saved the most important information for last. The security cameras had recorded everything. Every word Dad had said during my stroke, every moment of his dismissal and hostility, every second of his complete failure to recognize a medical emergency happening right in front of him. All of it was captured in high-definition digital video with crystal clear audio. "Marcus," Emma said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard, "you need to see that footage. I watched it with Mom yesterday, and it's devastating. Dad's behavior is so much worse than I even realized at the moment. He spent nearly 10 minutes accusing you of faking a stroke while you were literally having one." This was when the idea first started forming. As my cognitive abilities returned and I began understanding the full scope of what had happened, I realized that this wasn't just a family dispute anymore. This was documented evidence of medical neglect that had nearly cost me my life. Dad's years of dismissing health concerns, his systematic undermining of my medical care, his threats and manipulation, all of that had culminated in a moment where he'd actively prevented appropriate emergency response during a life-threatening crisis. Over the next week, as I slowly regained my strength and speech abilities, I started gathering information. Emma became my secret ally in this process. As a nurse, she understood both the medical implications of what had happened and the legal ramifications of Dad's behavior. She also had access to my medical records and could help me understand exactly how close I'd come to dying or suffering permanent severe disability. Dr. Rebecca Foster, the neurologist overseeing my recovery, was blunt about the situation during one of our consultations. "Mr. Chen, your symptoms over the past several months were textbook warning signs of the arterial condition that caused your stroke. If you'd received appropriate follow-up care after your initial evaluations, we likely could have prevented this entirely. The delay in emergency treatment when the stroke occurred could have been catastrophic." When I explained the family dynamics that had led to both the delay in diagnosis and the delay in emergency care, Dr. Foster's expression grew very serious. "What you're describing isn't just unfortunate, it's a pattern of medical neglect that put your life at risk. The fact that someone actively discouraged you from seeking care and then prevented timely emergency response during a stroke, that has serious implications." Emma helped me request copies of all my medical records, including the emergency room reports and paramedic documentation. The picture that emerged was damning. Multiple healthcare providers had documented my father's interference with my care. The paramedic report specifically noted family members insisted the patient was faking symptoms despite obvious stroke presentation. The ER notes mentioned father continued to claim the patient has a history of attention-seeking behavior even after stroke diagnosis was confirmed. But the security footage was the smoking gun. Emma had convinced Mom to download the relevant files from the camera system before Dad could think to delete them. We had multiple angles of the entire incident, from the moment I entered the kitchen to the moment the paramedics arrived. The audio was clear enough to catch every word, every dismissive comment, every moment of Dad's failure to provide appropriate help during a medical emergency. Watching that footage for the first time was surreal and enraging. There I was, clearly in severe distress, obviously experiencing neurological symptoms, and there was Dad treating it like a performance he was tired of watching. The moment when my left side stopped working was visible on camera. You could see my arm go limp, see me slump sideways, see the panic in my eyes as I lost the ability to speak. And you could hear Dad's response, accusations of attention-seeking and dramatics. As I watched that video, something fundamental shifted in how I saw my relationship with my family. This wasn't just years of dismissiveness or emotional abuse. This was a man who'd been so committed to his narrative about my supposed weakness that he'd continued believing it even while watching me have a stroke. His need to be right about my attention-seeking behavior had been more important to him than my life. That's when I started making calls, first to a medical malpractice attorney, David Rodriguez, who specialized in cases involving delayed diagnosis and medical neglect. When I described the situation and mentioned that I had video evidence of family interference with emergency care, he agreed to meet with me immediately. David reviewed the security footage, medical records, and documentation of Dad's pattern of discouraging medical care. His assessment was straightforward. While this wasn't traditional medical malpractice, since Dad wasn't a healthcare provider, it was potentially criminal medical neglect that had resulted in serious harm. The video evidence was so clear and compelling that it would be impossible for Dad to deny what had happened. Next, I contacted an employment attorney, Michelle Torres, about the workplace implications. Sarah had already started documenting Dad's inappropriate communications about my medical condition, and there were potential issues around family interference with my employment that needed to be addressed. But the most important call was to my cousin Jake Martinez, who worked as an investigative producer for one of Austin's local news stations. Jake had always been skeptical of Dad's controlling behavior, and when I described what had happened and mentioned the video evidence, he immediately saw the story's potential. "Marcus, this isn't just a family dispute," Jake said during our phone conversation. "This is a story about medical discrimination, family abuse, and how dismissive attitudes toward health concerns can have life-threatening consequences. The video evidence makes it impossible to dismiss or minimize. People need to see this." I also started researching Dad's employer, Lone Star Insurance Group, and their policies regarding employee conduct and public relations. As a regional manager, Dad was expected to maintain certain professional standards and community reputation. Having video evidence of him preventing emergency care during his son's stroke would likely violate several company policies, especially given the potential for negative publicity. The strategic plan that emerged was multi-pronged. First, ensure that all evidence was properly preserved and backed up in multiple locations. Second, pursue legal accountability through both civil and potentially criminal channels. Third, address the workplace implications and Dad's professional consequences. Fourth, use media attention to highlight the broader issues around medical dismissal and health advocacy. Emma helped coordinate with other family members who'd witnessed Dad's pattern of medical dismissal over the years. My cousin Lisa, Uncle Tom's daughter, came forward with stories about how Dad had discouraged her from seeking treatment for what turned out to be endometriosis. My Aunt Patricia remembered incidents where Dad had minimized her children's health concerns during family gatherings. What emerged was a documented pattern spanning decades, with my stroke being the culmination rather than an isolated incident. This wasn't one bad day or a misunderstanding. This was systematic behavior that had put multiple family members at risk and had finally resulted in a life-threatening situation.
The most crucial element was timing. Dad still didn't know that we had the security footage or that I was building a case against him. He'd been telling people his version of events, that I'd had some kind of anxiety attack that got blown out of proportion, that doctors these days overdiagnose everything, that the whole situation had been exaggerated by hospital staff looking to make money. His continued dismissal of what had happened, even after my stroke diagnosis was confirmed, provided additional evidence of his mindset and showed that he hadn't learned anything from nearly losing his son. This ongoing denial would make the eventual revelation of the video footage even more devastating to his credibility and reputation. By the time I was discharged from the hospital 2 weeks after my stroke, I had legal representation, media contacts, documented evidence, and a clear strategy for holding Dad accountable for his actions. The man who'd spent years controlling and dismissing his family through fear and manipulation was about to discover that some consequences can't be avoided through intimidation or denial. The foundation was set for what would become the most public and devastating accountability he'd ever faced. The execution of my plan began on a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 1 month after my discharge from the hospital. I'd spent those 4 weeks carefully orchestrating every detail, and the timing was perfect. Dad had settled back into his routine, confident that the medical crisis was behind us and that life could return to normal. He had no idea that the security system he'd installed to control his family was about to destroy his carefully constructed world. The first move was the most important, securing the evidence permanently. Working with David Rodriguez, my attorney, we had all the security footage professionally copied and authenticated by a digital forensics expert. The originals remained on Dad's system, but we now had legally admissible copies that he couldn't delete or manipulate. The video quality was so clear, you could see every facial expression, every gesture, every moment of his callous dismissal while I was having a stroke. At 9 a.m. that Tuesday, I was sitting in David's office as he made the first official call to Lone Star Insurance Group's corporate headquarters. He spoke directly with their legal department, explaining that they had an employee whose documented behavior had created significant liability exposure for the company. When David mentioned that we had video evidence of their regional manager preventing emergency medical care during a family member's stroke, the corporate attorney requested an immediate meeting. Simultaneously, my cousin Jake was preparing the news story at Channel 12. He'd already reviewed all the footage and medical documentation, and the station's legal team had cleared the story for broadcast. The segment would air during the evening news, but Jake had arranged for advance copies to be sent to Dad's employer, his colleagues, and several community organizations where he held leadership positions. The second phase began at 2 p.m. when representatives from Lone Star Insurance arrived at Dad's office for what he thought was a routine management meeting. Instead, he found himself facing the company's head of human resources, their legal counsel, and his district supervisor. They played portions of the security footage on a laptop right there in his office. Emma, who was keeping tabs on Dad's schedule through Mom, called me with updates throughout the afternoon. According to Mom, Dad had texted her around 2:30 saying he was in some kind of emergency meeting and would be home late. By 3 p.m., Mom received another text saying he might need to come home early due to work complications. The footage spoke for itself. There was no way to explain away or minimize what was clearly visible: a man watching his son have a stroke and accusing him of attention-seeking behavior instead of calling for help. The corporate representatives were reportedly stunned by what they saw. This wasn't just poor judgment, it was behavior that created massive liability for a company whose business depends on public trust and credibility. Dad was immediately placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. His corporate email and system access were suspended on the spot. The HR representative informed him that the company would be conducting interviews with all family members and medical professionals involved to determine the full scope of potential liability. They also made it clear that his position was in serious jeopardy. But the real earthquake hit when Dad got home around 4 p.m. and found the entire family waiting for him in the living room. Mom, Emma, Uncle Tom, Aunt Patricia, and Cousin Lisa were all there.
I'd coordinated this confrontation to happen before the news story aired, giving him one chance to face the family before his behavior became public knowledge. Emma had prepared a detailed presentation using her medical training to explain exactly what had happened during my stroke and how Dad's actions had endangered my life. She walked through each moment of the security footage, pointing out the obvious neurological symptoms I was displaying and contrasting them with Dad's dismissive responses. Dad, Emma said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing, Marcus was showing textbook stroke symptoms: left-sided weakness, speech difficulties, facial drooping, confusion. Any first aid course would have taught you to call 911 immediately. Instead, you spent 10 minutes accusing him of faking it. Uncle Tom, who had previously supported Dad's skeptical attitude toward my medical concerns, was visibly shaken as he watched the footage. "Robert, what the hell is wrong with you? That's your son having a medical emergency, and you're standing there calling him attention-seeking? I can't believe what I'm seeing." Mom, who had been torn between loyalty to her husband and concern for her son, finally found her voice. "I've watched this video a dozen times, Robert. I keep hoping I'll see something different, but every time it's the same. You were more concerned about being right than about Marcus's life." Dad's response was exactly what I'd expected: denial, deflection, and attempts to control the narrative. He claimed the footage was taken out of context, that we didn't understand the full situation, that he'd been dealing with years of my supposed hypochondriac behavior and had made a reasonable assumption. He accused the family of ganging up on him and turning a medical misunderstanding into a conspiracy against him. But then came the moment that broke his composure completely. Lisa pulled out her phone and showed him the preview of Jake's news segment, scheduled to air in just 3 hours. The story was titled, "Local Man Accused Son of Attention-Seeking During Stroke. Security Camera Caught It All." Dad watched in stunned silence as Jake's voiceover explained the situation while the security footage played on screen. "This story will air at 6 p.m. on Channel 12, Lisa said quietly. "Jake gave you the courtesy of a heads up, but the story is running whether you cooperate or not. The question is whether you want to get ahead of this or let it bury you completely." That's when Dad's carefully maintained facade finally cracked. The man who had controlled every family conversation for decades, who had dismissed every concern and minimized every problem, was suddenly faced with consequences he couldn't manipulate or intimidate away. His face went pale, his hands started shaking, and for the first time in my adult life, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. "You can't do this," he whispered, looking around the room at family members who were no longer willing to enable his behavior. "This will ruin everything: my job, my reputation, everything I've worked for. You're destroying the family over a misunderstanding." The news story aired at 6 p.m. as scheduled, and the impact was immediate and devastating. Jake had done an exceptional job presenting the facts without sensationalizing them. He let the security footage speak for itself, supplemented with interviews with Dr. Foster about stroke symptoms and the importance of immediate medical response. The story included statistics about how dismissive attitudes toward health concerns disproportionately affect young adults and can delay critical care. Within an hour of the broadcast, Dad's phone started ringing non-stop. Colleagues, neighbors, friends, and community members who had seen the story were calling with questions, concerns, and in many cases, their own stories about his dismissive attitude toward health and safety issues. The Rotary Club, where he served as treasurer, left a message requesting his resignation. His golf club called to discuss his membership status. Social media exploded overnight. The video clips from the news story were shared thousands of times across Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok. Comments poured in from people sharing their own experiences with family members who had dismissed their medical concerns. The story became a flashpoint for discussions about medical gaslighting, family abuse, and the importance of taking health symptoms seriously regardless of the patient's age. But the most satisfying response came from Dad's workplace. By Wednesday morning, Lone Star Insurance had issued a public statement distancing themselves from their employees' actions and announcing that they were conducting a thorough review of the situation. The statement emphasized their commitment to community values and appropriate response to medical emergencies. Behind the scenes, I learned from David Rodriguez that the company was in full damage control mode. Their legal team was terrified of potential lawsuits, not just from me, but from other families who might have been affected by Dad's attitudes toward medical issues in his professional capacity. Insurance companies depend on public trust, and having an employee publicly documented as preventing emergency medical care was a nightmare scenario for their reputation. Dad made one desperate attempt to salvage the situation by calling a press conference for Thursday morning, intending to present his side of the story and claim that the media coverage was unfair. It was a catastrophic mistake. Reporters who had seen the security footage asked pointed questions about his behavior that he couldn't answer adequately. When asked directly why he had accused his son of attention-seeking instead of calling 911 during an obvious medical emergency, he became defensive and hostile. The press conference, which was supposed to rehabilitate his image, instead provided additional footage of him being dismissive and argumentative when challenged about his actions. Several reporters noted that his demeanor during the press conference was remarkably similar to his attitude toward his son during the stroke, suggesting a pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident. By Friday, less than a week after the plan's execution began, Dad's entire world had collapsed. He was terminated from his job with cause, expelled from multiple community organizations, and facing potential criminal charges for medical neglect. The mortgage company had been notified that his employment was terminated, triggering reviews of their loan agreements. His reputation in Austin's business community was completely destroyed. But perhaps most importantly, the family dynamics that had enabled his controlling behavior for decades were permanently shattered. Mom filed for separation that Friday, moving in with Emma temporarily while she figured out her next steps. Uncle Tom publicly apologized for ever supporting Dad's dismissive attitude toward my health concerns. Other family members came forward with their own stories of his problematic behavior, creating a comprehensive picture of someone who had used fear and intimidation to maintain control for years. The man who had spent decades minimizing everyone else's problems was now facing consequences so severe that no amount of dismissal or denial could make them go away. His own surveillance system had provided the rope he'd used to hang himself, and there was no family member left willing to enable or protect him from the fallout of his actions. The immediate phase of accountability was complete, but the long-term consequences were just beginning to unfold. 6 months after the news story aired, I was sitting in my new downtown Austin apartment reading an email from the Travis County District Attorney's Office. They were officially filing charges against Robert Chen for reckless endangerment and failure to render aid during a medical emergency. The security camera footage that had started as Dad's tool of control had become the cornerstone of a criminal case that would forever change how Texas law addresses family medical neglect. The legal victory was satisfying, but it was just one piece of a much larger transformation that had rippled through every aspect of our lives. The stroke that Dad had dismissed as attention-seeking behavior had become a catalyst for accountability that extended far beyond our family drama. Let me start with Dad's complete professional destruction, because the scope of it was breathtaking. After his termination from Lone Star Insurance, word spread quickly through Austin's business community. The insurance industry is surprisingly small and interconnected, and having video evidence of preventing emergency medical care made him essentially unemployable in any position requiring public trust or customer interaction. His attempts to find equivalent work were repeatedly sabotaged by the viral nature of the story. Potential employers would Google his name and immediately find dozens of articles, video clips, and social media posts about his behavior. Several companies confirmed through back channels that they'd withdrawn job offers after discovering his identity. One HR manager told a mutual contact that hiring someone with Dad's documented callousness toward medical emergencies would create impossible liability exposure. By March, 6 months after his termination, Dad was working the night shift at a warehouse distribution center, making less than a quarter of his previous salary. The man who had built his identity around professional success and authority was reduced to inventory management and loading dock supervision. His new co-workers, many of whom had seen the news coverage, treated him with a mixture of suspicion and disgust that made every workday a humiliation. The financial consequences cascaded quickly. Without his management-level income, Dad couldn't maintain the mortgage payments on the family home. The house where he'd wielded absolute authority, where his security cameras had captured his downfall, went into foreclosure within 4 months. Mom had already moved out, but watching Dad forced to sell the symbol of his success at a significant loss was poetic justice. Emma and I helped Mom find a comfortable 2-bedroom apartment near the hospital where she continued her bookkeeping work. For the first time in decades, she was making decisions without fear of Dad's disapproval. She joined a support group for spouses of controlling partners and began therapy to address the years of emotional manipulation she'd endured. Watching her personality emerge from under Dad's oppressive influence was like seeing someone come back to life. The criminal case moved forward steadily. David Rodriguez had connected me with prosecutor Angela Stewart, who specialized in elder abuse and family neglect cases. She explained that while my case didn't fit traditional categories, the video evidence was so compelling that it had prompted discussions about expanding Texas law to better address medical neglect by family members. What your father did, Angela told me during one of our meetings, represents a form of abuse that we're just beginning to understand legally. Using psychological manipulation to prevent someone from seeking medical care, then actively interfering with emergency response, this creates a legal precedent that could help other families in similar situations. The media attention continued for months, but it evolved into something more constructive than just viral outrage. Medical organizations began using my case as a teaching tool about the importance of taking patient symptoms seriously, regardless of family dynamics. Dr. Foster was invited to speak at conferences about medical gaslighting and how healthcare providers could better advocate for patients whose families were dismissive of their concerns. Jake's original news story won several journalism awards, including a regional Emmy for investigative reporting. But more importantly, it had sparked a national conversation about medical dismissal within families. Support groups formed online for people who had experienced similar invalidation of their health concerns. The hashtag #BelievePatients became a rallying cry for medical advocacy organizations. My own recovery became part of the story's positive outcome. The physical therapy and speech therapy I'd needed after the stroke were covered by a settlement with Dad's former employer, who wanted to avoid a wrongful termination lawsuit. Lone Star Insurance had determined that Dad's pattern of dismissing medical concerns had created liability in several customer service situations where he'd minimized claims related to health emergencies. But the most meaningful recovery was psychological. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't second-guessing my own perceptions or minimizing my needs to avoid conflict. The stroke had been a devastating experience, but the aftermath had freed me from a lifetime of conditioning to doubt myself. When I had symptoms now, even minor ones, I sought appropriate medical care without shame or hesitation. My relationship with Emma grew stronger as we processed our shared experiences of Dad's controlling behavior. She left her job at Austin General and took a position with the county health department, focusing on community education about stroke prevention and recognition. She frequently told my story during presentations, emphasizing how family dismissal could delay critical care. The saddest part, Emma would tell her audiences, is that my brother had been having warning symptoms for months, but family pressure made him minimize them. If he'd felt supported in seeking care earlier, the stroke might have been prevented entirely. The community impact was substantial and lasting. Austin's medical community adopted new protocols for identifying patients who might be experiencing family medical gaslighting. Several hospitals created patient advocacy positions specifically designed to help people navigate unsupportive family dynamics during health crises. Dad's former social circles remained permanently closed to him. The Rotary Club not only expelled him, but used his case as an example during ethics training about community responsibility. His golf club membership was terminated, and several former friends made it clear that his behavior had disgusted them beyond any possibility of reconciliation. Most tellingly, other family members began sharing their own stories about Dad's dismissive behavior over the years. Cousin Lisa published a blog post about how Dad had discouraged her from seeking treatment for severe menstrual pain, delaying her endometriosis diagnosis by 2 years.
Uncle Tom wrote a letter to the local newspaper apologizing for enabling Dad's attitude and describing incidents where he'd witnessed medical concerns being minimized or dismissed. These revelations painted a picture of systemic behavior spanning decades, making it impossible for anyone to claim that my stroke incident was an isolated misunderstanding. The pattern was clear, documented, and devastating to any remaining sympathy Dad might have received. The legal resolution came in August, nearly a year after my stroke. Dad accepted a plea bargain rather than face trial, pleading guilty to reckless endangerment. The judge's sentencing remarks were scathing. "Mr. Chen, your actions represent a betrayal of the most fundamental family duty, to protect and care for loved ones in medical emergencies. Your documented pattern of dismissing health concerns put your son's life at risk and violated basic standards of human decency." Dad received 18 months probation, 200 hours of community service at a hospital emergency room, and mandatory counseling for controlling behavior. The probation terms also included a restraining order preventing him from contacting me directly and required court approval for any communication with other family members. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence was completely unplanned. Dad's new warehouse job required periodic safety training, including courses on emergency response and first aid. According to Emma, who heard this through workplace connections, Dad was required to watch training videos about recognizing stroke symptoms and the importance of immediate medical response. The irony of him learning proper stroke recognition after dismissing his own son's stroke was not lost on anyone aware of the situation. The anniversary of my stroke became something unexpected, a celebration rather than a traumatic reminder. Emma and I started hosting an annual awareness event for stroke prevention and family medical advocacy. We partnered with Austin hospitals and support organizations to create educational programs about recognizing emergencies and supporting family members' health concerns. Mom attended the first anniversary event and spoke about her experience enabling dismissive behavior. Her courage in publicly acknowledging her role in the family dysfunction inspired other spouses and parents to examine their own patterns of medical minimization. The event raised significant funds for stroke research and patient advocacy programs. As I write this, 18 months after my stroke, Dad remains effectively exiled from the family and community he once dominated through fear and control. He lives alone in a studio apartment, works a job he despises, and faces the daily reality that his reputation and relationships are permanently destroyed. The security cameras he installed to monitor his family captured the moment that ended his authority forever. Meanwhile, the rest of us have rebuilt our lives around mutual support and respect for each other's experiences. Mom has started dating someone from her support group, a kind, gentle man whose first marriage also ended due to controlling behavior. Emma was promoted to a supervisory role in the health department and is considering returning to school for her master's degree in public health. As for me, I'm healthier than I've been in years, both physically and emotionally. The stroke recovery was challenging, but I regained full speech and most of my left side strength. More importantly, I learned to advocate for myself and trust my own perceptions about my health and needs. The apartment I rent now has no security cameras, no one monitoring my comings and goings, no one questioning my medical decisions or dismissing my concerns. It's a simple freedom that I never fully appreciated until I'd lived without it for so long. Sometimes people ask if I feel guilty about the extent of Dad's downfall. The honest answer is no. His behavior nearly killed me, and the only reason it stopped was because he finally faced consequences he couldn't intimidate or manipulate away. The security system he'd installed to control his family ended up providing the evidence that set us all free from his toxic influence. The cameras meant to watch us instead revealed who he really was. And that revelation changed everything. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.